As suggested by the title and thumbnail, this video will eventually be about Gale Hawthorne, but the road to my thoughts on him is long, winding, and it begins with establishing my personal relationship to the Hunger Games, which I can best describe as resembling the relationship a lot of people around my age appear to have with Harry Potter. By this I mean that they were the first books I ever loved. Guess I bet on the better horse. Y'all stay safe though. If you frequent my channel, this might come as a surprise, but I once considered my hatred for reading a personality trait. I mean, my parents were both avid readers, as was my older sister, so I suppose it was in an effort to rebel against my geeky nerd family that I BS'd my way through every book report and subsequently failed every spelling test in elementary school. As a matter of fact, hadn't Jamie, my sister, successfully peer pressured me into cracking open this particular book, I might very well be illiterate today. But peer pressure me she did, and that's not all. No, she also introduced me to the embarrassing world of Facebook roleplay. Thus, a writer was born. I wake up the morning of the reaping. I don't think I will be picked. That morning, I do all the normal things you should do the morning of the reaping. I take a shower, do my hair all nice, and put on my most beautiful dress. When the reaping starts, I'm sitting there not even paying any attention. Then they call my name. Tribute District 11, Sage Green. I don't want to hear my name. I want to hear Apollas. I hate her. She is so mean to me at school, but it's me. I walk up like nothing's the matter, but that's because I'm so shocked that I can't show emotion. Then the boy tribute is called Can Opener Soup. I would know that name anywhere. He's popular at school and has been at training all his life for this. When I was reading these earlier, that's something, I don't know if that was his storyline. Like, this was another role player. I don't know. I don't know if I made up his storyline, and also if I'm from District 11, a boy is not training his whole life for this. And there's no like periods. It's all just so unfair.
You have one up there.
Yeah. I don't stand a chance against him unless we become allies. That's what I need to do. I need allies. Then I might stand a chance. I get put in a room with gold couches. I get to say goodbye to my family. They all come in, my dad and my two sisters. We hug the entire time. I cry and tell them I live them. They say the same to me. Then they get carried out of the room by tall men. I see who comes in to see Can Opener. Just his family I see around, then off to the capital we go. I have no idea what the end of that was supposed to be.
Yeah, that was... Want to form an alliance?
Yes, I would.
Cool. Anybody else you can think of that we should invite to the alliance? I asked my district partner, but she fights alone, I guess.
Yeah, my sister Jamie in real life, her name in the roleplay is Valentines.
Yep, maybe, but I might have an ally already with someone, so just maybe.
Elusive. Anyway, the relevant detail of my origin story is what specifically convinced me to give the Hunger Games a chance. Because the way I remember it, after her attempts to simply recommend the book to me didn't land, Jamie hedged her bets on showing me one of those fan-made scene reenactments of it on YouTube, notably one based on an Everlark moment.
I remember everything about you. It's you who wasn't paying attention.
I am now.
She also, of course, filled me in on the basic context that these two were allies in a televised fight to the death, and oh no, I was hella intrigued. What would happen to Katniss, and what would become of British Peeta? Obviously, I was too proud to admit that she'd caught me hook, line, and sinker, so I snuck into my sister's bedroom to steal her copy and started reading it in secret. In the end, though, I grew desperate to talk about it, so I fessed up, and the rest is her story. Sorry, I am way late. I run to the cornucopia and grab a bow and arrows and 2 backpacks and lots of knives. Then I run and meet with others. We shoot a bear and then walk for a long time and find a cave. We stay there, and I look in my packs to find there is one med kit in both that both contain different things and lots of water. Now I won't have to I won't have to drink pee like Can Opener, I think.
Can Fisher's pee?
Yeah, I don't know if that, maybe he was probably in the role-playing page saying he was drinking pee.
Yeah,
I'm really not sure.
But I don't know how you knew that.
So you chose the hands getting chopped off? Otherwise you're dead, sorry.
Wait, what?
Well, somebody cut your hands, and when you were online, they shot some arrows at you, so I'm giving you the choice to either have your hands cut off or you're dead. Sorry, but yeah.
I don't know how my hands were cut off, so I see that my hands are cut off. I used my teeth and my ally helps me put bandages on my wrists. I start practicing using.
And then it's gone. I don't know what you were practicing using. I see Valo, I throw my spear at them. Sometimes you guys have to miss me.
An arrow hit me in the wrist just on my robot hand. With fury, I shoot an arrow at Glitter and it hits her in the middle of the chest. I then shoot another at May and hit her in the right arm.
I am sitting and thinking I'm going to die at some point, right? And I am all in pain already. I want my death to be peaceful, not with a knife in the chest, so I run away from the others and find a beautiful snowy tree and sparkly snow on the ground and lay to wait for my death. I grab a knife and stab myself in the chest. I lay there and think of my family while I watch the pretty snow fall as I sing myself to my death. I did that because I knew it would be a good show. Lols. That's when we abandoned this page when we started
Right,
our
well, because
own
the
page.
admin always won.
Now, my reason for telling you all of this is because ever since the Hunger Games renaissance began with the movies being added to Netflix last spring and resurged upon the theatrical release of The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes, the fact that it was romance which drew me to the series in the first place has been on my mind, as has the fact that I went on to roleplay a part in the very means of oppression that its entire narrative serves to dismantle. It all feels pertinent to certain sentiments I've noticed floating around for years, but especially as of late. Sentiments which offer metatextual criticisms of us, the audience. You see, The Hunger Games wasn't the first of its kind, nor has it proven to be the last. Battle royales and other death games span mediums and markets in their appeal, but they always manage to differentiate themselves some way or another. And just one of many elements that sets THG apart is the broadcasting of the game. It's common in stories like these that rich benefactors arranged the whole thing for their entertainment, but the idea that society at large tunes in is unique, and it lends itself to a subtextual irony. Like, who am I to judge the Capitol for watching The Hunger Games when on March 22nd, 2012, I posted to Facebook that everyone should be jealous because after eating at Iggy's Sports Grill, I'd be seeing The Hunger Games. I laugh, but it's not an uninteresting train of thought, right? Evidently, some of us haven't always interacted with this property in the most thematically conscious manner, and likening myself to your average Capitol citizen could absolutely work as a rhetorical device in a grander essay. Suzanne Collins famously first conceptualized The Hunger Games while channel surfing between coverage of the Iraq War and reality TV, so I'd start there. Bring up Squid Game The Challenge, confess to being a Big Brother live feedster, and compare the second quarter quail to Survivor winners at war. I'd also likely attempt to explore how social media has fundamentally changed the news landscape for both better and worse. Then I'd want to get into how people like me, consumers of the global north and or taxpayers of the Western world, should view Suzanne's Capitol characters as examples. We can either take after Katniss Everdeen's prep team by perpetuating systemic problems, if not through malice, then through ignorant complacency, or we can strive to be like Cinna, like Tigris, or even like Plutarch by organizing for progress to the best of our ability.
Questions about how elements of the book might be relevant in their own lives. What do you think about choices your government, past and present, or other governments around the world make? What's your relationship to reality TV versus your relationship to the news?
Sounds awesome, actually. Maybe I should have made that video instead, but I've only outlined it for you here to make perfectly clear just how worthwhile I think it is to identify the Effie trinket within before I admit to my irritation with a recently popular application of this general comparison. Basically, as a response to large chunks of the fan base expressing interest in more theoretical prequels, specifically which would depict more previous Victor's games, I've come across a number of well-liked tweets and TikToks arguing that it's antithetical to the themes of the series to desire them and or that it would be hypocritical of Collins to write them. As established, I do not balk at the notion that there's an inherent subtextual irony to the Hunger Games franchise, hence why it never paired well with merchandising, but I am very much bothered by the implication that in some legitimate or borderline literal way, excitedly engaging with a fascinating fictional universe that was written to captivate you could in any context be ethically or psychologically equated to rah-rahing child-on-child combat. To be honest, and this might sound harsh, I feel as though to champion hot takes like these, one must have quit while they were behind. You started somewhere interesting, but you crash-landed before you arrived anywhere of real-world consequence. 72 more prequels could be released, one for each and every game, and still no children would have actually died. It's precisely because The Hunger Games is a title chock full of political messaging that it strikes me as a frustratingly insular takeaway, one bound by the confines of the series itself, to believe it a misinterpretation to be a fan of it in the first place. I mean, once you've walked this logic through to its rational conclusion, there's no reason why the original trilogy should be exempt. Whether we are discussing the novels or the films, their overwhelming success is in no doubt due in part to their provocative premise. If you find the demand for hypothetical future installments deeply alarming, then I have news for you about the installments you already know and love. Tell me, what is the objective number of entries it would be acceptable for Suzanne Collins to write before they became intrinsically gratuitous? And if you draw that line after Ballad, then what makes it so special? The fact that Suzanne managed for a third time to feature the games in a thematically rich manner? Well, what makes you think she couldn't do it again? Better yet, what makes you think anyone wants anything less? It's an unfair assumption to make of fans who are invested in the backstories of well-written supporting characters like Haymitch, Finnick, or Johanna that their confidence in Collins as an author isn't what keeps them wanting more, but rather their bloodlust. Trust. Nobody's in it because kid death is their favorite thing. Mind you, I'd like to think I'm not being defensive because personally, I'm not desperate for more content. Would I be stoked in the event that something were announced? Probably, but I'm satisfied with what we've got, and I respect a creative who's willing to leave a cash cow unmilked until inspiration strikes. Demands for new books and movies are often annoyingly put, I'll give you that. I've only meant to argue expressly against the idea that the ironic subtext of the Hunger Games franchise is anything more sinister than an ironic subtext. Distilled, that is precisely why I chose to subject you to this entire rant. Perhaps you've been worried that at some point I lost track of where we're going. But make no mistake, this is still the road to Gale. That was what we call a detour, and here's where it all converges. When I referred to various metatextual criticisms of the audience, the campaign against another hypothetical prequel was one of two that I had in mind. The other we'll call any and all love triangle denialism. If you, dear viewer, operate on the same internet as I do, you're likely well aware of how widely despised love triangles are. I once made a whole video in defense of them, in fact, and looking back, I'm not so sure I buy into what I said in it regarding Katniss, Peeta, and Gale. I, for one, would entertain the possibility that intentional or otherwise the love triangle is beneficial to the Hunger Games because readers were distracted by it similarly to how the capital citizens are distracted by the star-crossed lovers arc amidst tragedy. Full disclosure, I distinctly remember feeling like that was the most positive spin I could get away with, lest I be bombarded by maddening comments. In reality, I've never detected a satirical edge to Suzanne's handling of the love triangle, nor has my investment in it ever been meta in nature. Quite the contrary. I think it was played straight and well executed in earnest. I think it accomplished what love triangles at their best should set out to do, which is face a character with a decision between love interests who are representative of larger stakes. Furthermore, I resent the rampant opinion that for whatever senseless reason it doesn't count as a love triangle, or that if it does, then it was overblown in adaptation. But if it wasn't, and it was prevalent in the source material all along, then that's only because a corrupt cabal of evil higher-ups forced Suzanne Collins to include it. Not all of that can be true at once, you know? To be fair, not all of the screenshotted individuals are monolithic. Perhaps they don't each see eye to eye, but their unique perspectives have a lot in common. They strike a similar tone, at least. This tendency many fans have to hold the romantic element of the Hunger Games at arm's length isn't new, and speaking as someone who was there when the deep magic was written, I don't think Twilight's role in it all can be overstated. Despite their foundational differences in genre, tone, and overall quality, the fact that one female-led YA craze promptly took over for another led to a marketable conflation of the two. The omnipresent impulse among fans of the Hunger Games to distinguish them comes off to me as a subconscious effort to protect it from Twilight's fate. Bearing in mind its many faults, the misogynistic undertone of the initial backlash against Twilight has been well documented, and the fear that other properties popular with teenage girls will also be met with that kind of derision isn't unfounded. Back in the day, there absolutely were camps of people who wrote off the Hunger Games as just another something stupid for little girls. Not to name names, but YMS covered the first movie in a video which perfectly exemplifies what I'm talking about.
So the Hunger Games was kinda dumb, and I'm pretty sure most of you know that considering my YouTube demographics. I mean, it's not as bad as Twilight, but there are a lot of similarities within the fan base.
It goes on to be an exercise in frustration.
Plus, if you had a volunteer that was predetermined, you could just spend the entire year training them.
Yeah, they're called careers. That's not like book exclusive intel. It made the final cut.
Easy career. You know what that is?
I'm District 1.
And 2. They train in a special academy till they're 18. Then they volunteer. By that point, obviously they're pretty good. They win it almost every year, but they can be arrogant.
Because her score is 11 out of 10. What the fuck?
Did she score an 11 out of 10? Or was it an 11 out of 12?
As you know, the tributes are rated on a scale of 1 to 12.
And I guess the majority of the districts have already been using that strategy that I was talking about, because these kids are fucking pros for no reason. Really? 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 Your name was picked at random, right?
No, her name wasn't picked at random. She did volunteer. It's called being a career. But I guess some audiences are too dumb to pick up on details like that the first time.
Oh, in case you forgot when they told you that the wasp sting had hallucinogenics, they're gonna tell you again in case you're really, really dumb.
The venom of a trackerjacker sting produces powerful hallucinations.
Props for knowing your target audience.
I'll stop myself before this devolves into a response video. The review in question has stuck with me, but it's more than a decade old. My aim in dredging it up is to illustrate the cultural context this franchise was born into. All things considered, it's no surprise how many fans of The Hunger Games are eager to differentiate it from Twilight, but I worry it's a mistake in doing so to obfuscate their very real, if surface level, similarities. I worry we're bowing down to a false premise in defending the series by denying its hallmarks of female-led YA fare. I mean, to do so, you effectively concede that such tropes are inherently frivolous. Like, you're right, society, love triangles are naturally superficial and impossible to skillfully utilize. Hence why none of my favorite works of fiction technically depict them, or otherwise obviously shouldn't have. Meanwhile, you'd be majorly hacking up the trilogy's word count to edit out its love triangle. And the very last paragraphs of its very last chapter are spent concluding why Katniss chose one love interest over the other. It's a romantic subplot as inextricable from the central storyline as they come, and yet it's often frowned upon to acknowledge. Many consider the act of identifying with either team a shallow misinterpretation in and of itself. Look, to this day, The Hunger Games is my favorite book series, but I do think it's important to appreciate it for what it is, which is to say, the epitome of tropey, trendy YA literature. Thematically rich as it may be, personally, the older and wiser I get, the more depth I draw from each reread, it's never been comparable to reading actual sociopolitical theory. Rather, through a little thing called allegory, it served as an introduction to these dense topics accessible to preteens like myself, who'd literally never read before. Have you noticed that it's become a go-to example of how to execute the 3-act structure? It's a page-turner. It appeals to those of us interested in fashion and romance. That's all fine. Yes, it does depict a love triangle, and that's okay. So, let's lay to rest my least favorite of these rumors, shall we? Is it true that Collins originally intended for Katniss and Gale to be mere cousins, but her publicist, publisher, or perhaps a mysterious cloaked figure convinced her to add feelings to the mix as a means to attract mindless drones of YA readers? Well, I can't say for certain. After all, I wasn't there, but probably not. I mean, nobody involved with the project has ever said so, unless I missed something major in all of my Googling. It seems more likely to me at this point that somebody just conjured up a conspiracy theory one day, and it's since traveled all the way to tvtropes.org. It happens to be a literal plot point in Catching Fire that Katniss and Gale are made to pose as cousins to keep capital audiences from casting him as Peeta's romantic rival in their minds. As such, it's my assumption that this whole myth began as a misremembering of that detail mixed with uncharitable interpretations of interview answers some of her editors actually have given in regards to their impact on the love triangle. Kate Egan, for instance, once said she asked for more of it. Now, you could jump to a number of unreasonable conclusions based on that rather vague statement, and apparently many do, but really there's no telling the extent of more. What this phrasing surely does imply to me is that there was always a love triangle to want more of. That being the case, I regret to inform you that hired editors are an industry standard part of the publishing process, traditional or otherwise. It's good, actually, for them to recommend additions. That's their job. Now, for specifics, we turn to David Levithan, who's recounted often advocating for Team Gale in particular. By the way, it's of note to me that they freely used the T word throughout the creative process, but that's beside the point. According to him, it was even more obvious in earlier drafts than it still is in the published editions, to be frank, that Peeta was the guy. This, my friends, is where the question of why Gale comes into play. Notice that it's his role in the love triangle that's called into question when it's speculated whether he and Katniss were meant to be related. I've neglected to mention it, but a surprising contingent of love triangle deniers, as I've labeled them, are Everlark shippers. It's Everthorn they could do without. It's Gale they don't like, but they love them some Peeta, and who wouldn't? The boy with the bread is an easy character to love. He requires no defense. Before he even speaks a line of dialogue, we learn that he'd suffer a beating in order to feed a starving stranger, and his altruistic characterization doesn't let up from there. If he ever does act out of character, he either apologizes or it's because he's literally been hijacked. Gale, on the other hand, well, he's rougher around the edges. In some ways, he more closely resembles the archetype that typically wins out in young adult love triangles. He's the damaged one, the oh-so-complicated one, not to mention the tall, dark-haired one. More often than Peeta, he refers to their predicament in competitive terms, and he's at least twice as impatient with Katniss over her indecision. From the first book, in which he equates killing people to hunting animals, to the last, in which he remarks that he wouldn't hesitate to off every capital worker at the press of a button, Gale is framed in contrast to Peeta. I hope you understand better now what I meant when I said this love triangle does what they do best. It forces our protagonist to choose between representatives of grander stakes, and choice is the operative factor here. One could argue it possible for these characters to fulfill their roles without all of the kissing, but where would the stakes be in that? Platonic friendships are unlike monogamous relationships in that you get more than one. It's through the love triangle that she's faced with a decision. Romance doesn't threaten to distract us from the themes of the Hunger Games because it's busy reflecting them. Suzanne Collins doesn't go on record a lot, but if one thing's been made clear to me in reading and watching every interview she has given, it's that she views Pan Am as a setting to explore just war theory, which is, in her words, an attempt to define what circumstances give you the moral right to wage war and what is acceptable behavior within that war. Peeta and Gale then portray two perspectives in the just war debate. Keep in mind, I don't think that makes them entirely diametrically opposed. I mean, they're both revolutionaries in their own right. Where they differ is in their approach. Peeta might be nonviolent, but he's far from non-political. He doesn't show much of an aptitude for combat, but he does for public relations and optics. His acts of rebellion throughout the series mainly take the form of grand gestures or displays.
Yeah, I just keep wishing that I could think of a way to show them that they don't own me. Pray.
Stop! Stop!
We'd like to donate 1 month of our winnings to the families of the tributes every year for the rest of our lives. If it weren't for the baby.
Let's find out more. Calm down. This is news to all of us.
They're coming, Katniss. They're gonna kill everyone. And in District 13, you'll be dead by morning.
He's warning us. That was a warning.
Where I'd describe him as improvised, I'd describe Gale as tactical. In Mockingjay, the militaristic organization of District 13 suits him. There, he uses his hunting experience to help Beetee develop weapons of war.
You allow people enough time to rush in, help the wounded, then...
A second bomb.
Right.
Famously, one of those weapons goes on to kill Prim, which highlights the consequences of Gale's disregard for civilian casualties.
Even if those civilians are just mopping floors, they're helping the enemy. If they have to die, I can live with that.
We mustn't mistake his strategic attitude, though, for an unfeeling one. Look to Beatty for an example of an impersonal frame of mind. Gale is passionately invested in the rebellion. I'd argue he's more devoted to its cause than most. That's apparent from the moment he first catches wind of uprisings.
It's finally happening.
I should have just eaten the berries in the arena and died like I was supposed to. Then everything would be back to normal and everyone would be safe.
Safe for what? You haven't hurt people, Cudney. You've given them an opportunity. They just have to be brave enough to take it. There's already talk in the minds. People want to fight.
I'm no expert on just war theory, but I draw this distinction between strategic and unfeeling because I know a lot of people do believe that sometimes the ends justify the means in revolution. Regardless of whether that viewpoint is correct, I doubt Gale arrived at it through careful deliberation. My read is instead that his rage blinded him from any such ethical considerations from the start. Crucially, however, despite all of the above, the text never vilifies him. Even in the bitter end, even in Everthorn's final scene, Katniss wishes she could make peace with Gale's indirect role in her sister's death because she recognizes the circumstances he was under. She chooses the dandelion over the fire, hope over anger, but his send-off is sympathetic. Ultimately, I've gathered us here today to say that I think anti-Gale rhetoric has gone too far. I chuckled the first time I saw him called the Prim Reaper, and I've perpetuated Gale hate myself. But these days, I think it's important to realize his significance. I think it's imperative in analyzing his character to recognize him as a product of his environment. It's easy from the comfort of our local movie theaters or our personal reading nooks to speculate what we would have done differently. But suppose you were brought up in a society that annually rounded up your classmates for slaughter and made you watch. What sort of relationship would you have to the sanctity of human life then? If your hometown were carpet bombed out of existence, would you not be angry? In conclusion, I guess, Gale is because Gale matters.